There's several key determining factors that allow for us as players to discern when an MMO is in a severe decline. Empty servers is arguably the most obvious. Server merges to try and consolidate the remnants of a multitude of servers in an active effort to mitigate a decline is another. Reduced frequency of updates, a lower monthly financial return, releases on additional platforms to try and increase activity and subsequently earnings during said decline. Tower Fantasy checks each and every one of these. And don't get me wrong, Tower Fantasy has been a pretty large success for both Hada and Level Infinite. In 2022, Tower Fantasy managed to accumulate roughly $500 million between China and global across Android, iOS, and PC platforms. But after repeated incompetence shown on the part of the developers, bugs, hackers, exploiters, all of which I've covered in real time as they were happening, the game rapidly spiraled out of control. I honestly don't think that the devs were really prepared to deal with the sheer success that the game was experiencing, and they subsequently fumbled through the first several months, setting the standard for the game, a pretty low standard, admittedly, which leaves us where we are today, and is what we're here to cover today. Let's take a few minutes to look at where Tower Fantasy was when it launched, and then see where it's at now, 2/3 of a year later. Before we delve into Tower Fantasy, however, I want to take a moment here to shout out our insane patrons over on Patreon. You guys allow for me to continue to push out videos like this regularly, and I cannot express how grateful I am for that. Also, if you have a moment, come watch me over on Twitch. I'm going to be streaming Blue Protocol pretty much all week, the day it launches. Tower Fantasy launched onto PC, Android, and iOS in August 2022 and saw a grand total of 8.2 million players log in and test the game out, bringing in $26 million across Android and iOS devices. Note, these earnings are specific to mobile platforms and completely disregard PC. If other games like Genshin and Honkai Star Rail or anything to base this off of, roughly 50% or more of total sales happen on mobile devices. It's unconfirmed how large of a discrepancy there is with Tower Fantasy, however. This was admittedly a very good opening for Tower Fantasy, smaller than Nikke, also published by Level Infinite, which saw almost $100 million in its launch month, and more recently Honkai Star Rail, which saw $500 million earned in its launch month. Still trying to wrap my head around that one. September saw a decline in both new players and earnings, which is to be expected. Players are no longer in the honeymoon period. Nevertheless, there were still 600,000 new players and $20 million in revenue, only a small decline in total. For the months of August and September, Tower Fantasy remained in the 10 most played, highest grossing gacha games. However, in its third month, October, it fell to number 13 with 500,000 new players and a decline to $6 million. This was a catastrophic decline from 26 million to 6 million in a mere 2 months. November was a better month for Tower Fantasy, with players hoping that this would be a turning point for the game, as we saw a decrease in new players down to 200,000, but an increase in earnings up to $9 million. This unfortunately began the game's decline, which it has to date not recovered from. December and January are typically pretty large months for games. That was not the case for Tower Fantasy, as we saw the game decline back down to 200,000 new players and $6 million. Things seemed fairly stable at this juncture. They were not. January 2023 started the new year and saw Tower Fantasy for the first time fall out of the top 20 gacha games. While there were 300,000 new players, there was only $2.8 million in revenue, a record low. These were very concerning numbers. February continued this trend, seeing 150,000 new players and $2.9 million. March continued to remain stable, seeing 130,000 new players and $2.8 million. One thing worth noting is that the rate that Tower Fantasy was acquiring new players was decreasing by double-digit percentages every month. The key to a successful game is to have enough new players being introduced to it to supplement the loss of existing players. Earnings are great, but they'll decline quite rapidly if there's nobody left to play. April saw 180,000 new players and $2.8 million. At this point, Tower Fantasy had hit a stable point. several months, consecutively bringing in upwards of 100,000 new players and almost $3 million. Even in spite of large updates like 2.0, characters players were highly anticipating, nothing seemed to be capable of turning things around for the game. But I mean, hey, at least it hadn't dipped below $2 million, right? That's an accomplishment. May was the first time Tower of Fantasy dropped out of the top 30 gacha games, bringing in 100,000 new players and $1.4 million. Yes, 1 million. This is lower than Arknights. This is lower than Blue Archive, which brings in $10 to $20 million, just FYI. This is lower than Fate Grand Order, Azure Lane, Honkai Impact. And that's where we are currently. Tower of Fantasy saw its lowest month of earnings to date, followed by its lowest rate of new user acquisition. And unfortunately, after confirmation of server merges, I don't foresee it slowing down anytime soon. There's a reason that they delayed the PlayStation release as long as they did. It was to try and increase earnings and new players, even if for only a short period. Tower of Fantasy is in a very critical state right now and is continuing to decline at an alarming rate. Now, if Tower of Fantasy isn't your kind of game, absolutely no problem. I got you covered with 2 different videos on screen right now. It might be of more interest to you.